You've heard the phrase, it's my way or the highway. We often think in very narrow terms, considering our own limited, narrow perspective. But there's more out there. There's a bigger context that we're living in. In fact, we're living out our story in the context of a bigger story, in the context of God's story. Chapter 10 of the story presents a shift in the way God and His people would relate to each other. If you remember back toward the beginning, God first dealt directly with a man named Abraham. He would be the one that God would use to begin this nation of His own people. Next, we met Moses, who God used to lead His people to the Promised Land. God's leadership would continue through a series of people called judges, who brought God's people back to a place of safety and deliverance, and then also helped to restore that relationship. After the judges were a series of prophets who spoke on God's behalf. In each and every one of these scenarios, God was dealing directly with His people. We call that kind of a government a theocracy, but all of this was about to change. Now, before we get too far ahead, let's go back to the prophets. Understand that prophecy is more about speaking God's truth than predicting the future. The prophets were the people that God used to directly talk to His people, to bring them the message that He had for them. And what we'll come to find out is that usually that message was coming back, come and return to me. Well, Samuel was one of the prophets that God used to speak to Israel, and there's a lot we can learn from the story of Samuel. Samuel's story starts with a woman named Hannah. Now, Hannah had no children, and in a culture and during a time when a woman's worth was totally integrated with whether or not she had children, especially sons, this was devastating. So out of her desperation, Hannah prayed to God and made a vow to Him. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. So Hannah tells God that if He would give her a child, she would offer him back to God as an offering. Well, God allows Hannah to conceive, and she has a son and names him Samuel. After Samuel is weaned, he is brought back to God and will serve Him all of his days. And as an extra show of God's kindness and grace, God allows Hannah to conceive again and again, giving her 3 sons and 2 daughters. The priest that Samuel serves' name was Eli. Eli also had 2 sons of his own, but the Bible says they were wicked men. They were scoundrels. They used this position of being priests to their own benefit and for their own gain. But it's during this time that we get a glimpse into the life of Samuel as a young man. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. It's interesting to note that we get a similar glimpse into the boyhood of Jesus when we read this in Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with both God and men. Your participation in the story helps me to understand that you have a desire to know more about God's ways. I also realize that you have an interest in learning to see where your story fits in the context of the bigger story. There's another thing I know to be true. There are times along the way of your faith journey that you need encouragement and support and someone to be with you. Well, Samuel was no different. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3, we read this great exchange between Samuel the boy, Eli the priest, and God. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, Here I am, and he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, you called me? But Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. So he went and lay down. God was talking to Samuel, but Samuel didn't yet know God's voice. Samuel heard someone calling him and thought it was Eli, so he went to Eli. Well, this happened a second and a third time. Finally, Eli realized what was going on. God was trying to talk to Samuel. So Eli instructed Samuel on what he needed to do to hear from God. Well, the next time God called Samuel, Samuel was ready to listen.